And Dr. Yuter, Sandra, can you hear or see us?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. This is our Halloween themed Ladies Who Lunch conversation, and we have a lot to get to. But I must say, this has been the creepiest, spookiest, I'll say right up front that we've never had such technological issues. And I pride myself on being rather technology savvy, having worked for a number of technology companies in the past. So I'm like bowing and really appreciating Sandra, who's our very special guest today. I'm going to read her bio in a second, but I'll give you the background just as myself, as an author and as a landscape designer. The issues of climate and the, say, repercussions, manifestations, the implications, everything that it has, not only on our landscape design, our gardens, but everything from our food supplies to our transportation to the way we live. So I initially got the idea to have a climatologist, appear on our speak to us at our Metro Hort meetings, and then I was first introduced to Sandra that way. And so I'm absolutely thrilled that she can be here. I'll read a little bit about her. And she has a CV that is, like I said, it's so swoon worthy, you could just faint away. So I'll give you a little bit of background about her before we start, so I have to read this. Growing up on Long Island, Sandra Yuter loved to go on field trips. She learned about how glaciers had shaped the environment around her and was fascinated by how the resulting landscape still told the history of its geological past. The combination of scientific exploration and imagination that these field trips offered was something Sandra also drew to science fiction, that another passion that she shares with some of her cohort and fellow scientists. Sandra has turned her interest in science into a career, and that's what we want to talk about a little bit more here. She's a distinguished professor at the Department of Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences at North Carolina State University. She's a faculty fellow of the Center for Geospatial Analytics. And I think all these words for some of the viewers are almost alien to them. Her research uses measures made by remote sensors, including radar, satellite, and LIDAR, my favorite, as well as in situ measurements to understand processes in the atmosphere, especially those related to clouds and precipitation. And occasionally, she even gets to be a bit of a science fiction writer herself. So it's a perfect day, really, to talk about this. So, Sandra, if you could tell us first, I mean, I think here at Ladies Who Lunch, we highlight women who are very inspiring to us. And I think what you do is extraordinarily inspiring. And I think for a lot of young people, especially who are activists in trying to forge a way forward in terms of climate and sustainability, uh, they could also look to have a career here. So maybe you can share with us a little bit about more how you got interested in and what was your career path to getting to where you are today.
Okay, well, my career path is was not a straight line. I think as a as a kid, I was interested in science. Science was my favorite class. I was fortunate to have some really good science teachers. Actually elementary school, middle school, and high school. And but I didn't know what part of science I was actually interested in. I was kind of interested in a lot of different things. So my undergrad degree actually started in physics, but then transferred to geophysics, um, and studied, about sort of how we understand the structure of the Earth. But
Did you
frankly, I
have
was.
did you have
Hmm?
teachers or parents that encouraged you, or did you
Oh
feel?
no, definitely. My parents were very encouraging, which was really helpful. So neither of them was a scientist, but they were very encouraging of my interest. And one of the things they did that I think it seems minor, but I think it really helped. So when I was a teenager, they kind of enrolled me in this monthly science kit of the month club.
Oh.
And so every month we'd get this little thing in this little tube, and I get to play around with different things. And then also my dad let me set up kind of like a little laboratory in the basement, and he had an old chemistry set. So I get to, and there was like a book of experiments, so I get to play around with that. So yeah, no, that they were very, very supportive.
I think that's so much fun too. When I was a kid, um, I had my own microscope and my slides, and I would go out and get things, but it was very different, especially for a girl. Like a lot of people didn't really understand why I was so
Yeah,
interested.
no, I totally, yeah, people did not understand. They thought I was pretty weird, but my parents were supportive, so that made
Right,
all the difference.
right. So then you go on to, so I'll say cheers to that. And to your,
Okay.
so
Yeah,
then
so
you get a track in school that sort of encourages you then?
yeah, so but I think I was pretty burned out after my undergrad degree, and I didn't, so I didn't want to go on to grad school right away. Um, in fact, I couldn't imagine staying in school any longer.
You were like,
So I went off and worked for a while as a software engineer. First for a company, a big aerospace company in California, and then for a smaller company that did artificial intelligence. And then I ended up working for one of the companies that had bought one of our artificial intelligence systems, which was called the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And that's the first time I started doing meteorology.
I
So
see.
I was working for the National Center for Atmospheric Research as a software engineer. And while I was there, I realized that the scientists were having way more fun than I was. So I started asking about, okay, well, this has been an interest I've had my whole life. What do I need to do to be trained up as a scientist? And they said, well, you need to go to grad school. So I was like, okay. So yeah, I
Would
applied to
you
grad
say
school.
if
Hmm?
someone is following like a career path, to be a climatologist, a scientist, that they continue to study in school, or like you say, no, I'm going to pivot and then get some of my experience in the corporate or
I
government?
think it really depends. I think my experience in the corporate world has really served me very well. Um, so I think my suggestion to students is that if you're sure what you want to do, then go ahead and go to grad school right away. But if you're not sure, I think you're better off going off and working and figuring that out, because, you know, grad students struggle when they aren't sure why they're here.
Mm.
So I think it's perfectly fine to take a couple of years between undergrad and grad school to kind of figure out what your priorities are and what you're really interested in. And then, what I find is those students who do take that time when they become grad students, they're very focused,
And
and that
also,
really helps them.
when you really got into it, not only was it new for women, I dare say, but also kind of new for anybody. I mean, do you see the progression and sort of expansion of this whole area that you're involved in?
Well, I think, so atmospheric science did not have a lot of women. I think the first women PhD was probably maybe late 60s, early 70s. It was Joanne Simpson. Um, and you know, kind of women PhDs in atmospheric science were fewer and far between. And then I think starting in the 80s, things started to pick up a bit. Um, a lot of women stop at the master's degree for a variety of reasons. And I think actually a lot of good reasons. For a lot of research jobs, you don't need a PhD. The PhD is more needed if you're planning to work at a university, um, or at a to lead a team at a research lab. But for a lot of work, and particularly in industry, a master's degree is often sufficient training, because when you go into that industry, they're going to train you up
Right.
in whatever that industry is. Say, for example, you're in renewable energy. You know, we don't. Industry is kind of moving faster than academia, in a lot of ways, and so, the specific training in, like, for example, figuring out where to site wind farms and things like that. People learn that when on the job rather than in grad school.
I've also read and seen that, you know, businesses, whether they're vineyards, vintners, or oil companies, I dare say that they look to your profession in order to help them forecast the future because so much money is involved. Is that true? From
Well, I think everyone wants to know what the future is going to be, but I think it's very uncertain, actually. I mean, it's definitely going to get warmer, but exactly how much warmer and how that's distributed geographically is kind of the big question. And one of the biggest uncertainties with our climate models is actually not the atmospheric science side, it's actually the economic side.
Mhm.
So you've probably seen, with the climate models where they talk about different scenarios. Those scenarios are essentially economic scenarios about how, what's going to happen with the energy intensity of the various economies, how fast things are going to be decarbonized. Those are not physics questions for atmospheric science. And so I think that sort of, adds a big source of uncertainty about like which economic model. And some of these economic models are kind of more optimistic or simplistic than others.
Mhm.
So I think we do have a very clear information that it's going to get warmer. We do have clear information about sort of the range of scenarios, but part of the issue, I think, in terms of, let's say, states, county, and local governments making decisions, is that in some sense that uncertainty, I think, can be paralyzing because they're not quite sure what to do. And so, one of the things that we're looking at is actually trying to help them by giving them information about the climate change that has already happened. And I actually looked up our numbers for your area. So, one of the things we're looking at is the number of hours in a year where the temperature is less than freezing. And this is particularly important if you think about both plants and invasive insects, right? With invasive insects, right? They, they don't like when it's cold for long, right? So if it starts getting warmer, then their range extends. So what I looked up for the New York area, so since the 70s, about the mid 1970s, um, the New York area has lost the equivalent of 14 days of temperatures less than freezing. So this kind of information about like the recent climate change that's already happened, I think it's very easy to explain to people because you're not dependent on this sort of uncertain economic forecasts. And I
Yeah,
think it can help, as I said, business owners and state and counties make decisions about where to put resources for adaptation.
yeah, I see an imbalance in a way, so I appreciate that and you looking up, and I think it helps explain to the audience and viewers in ways they can more readily understand. But then I think there's folks who, whether they're in government or regular family folks, that they just can't. It's so weighty on them to think about the future and what to do. And then there's always the kick the can scenario for,
Yeah.
government. So I can understand when you say like businesses may need to move forward or perhaps, lead the way. I mean, for us, in horticulture, it's, the canary in the coal mine kind of thing. I particularly saw it very acute this summer with more insects and invasive plants because we don't get those cold days. I mean, a lot of people say, I don't
Right.
care about climate. If it gets warmer, we're up here, but you don't think about people who live in hot climates or, migrations that happen because they don't have access to it. So that's a lot to unpack, but also if you can comment, so much now on aggressive storms. I mean, I try to tell my garden design clients, it's not that it's going to rain so much. And I know people always say, when I was a kid, it did this and that, but they're more aggressive now.
Yeah, I think the thing about the extreme events is it's hard for people to wrap their heads around it, because it's not like an every year thing. I think if we think about like what happened with Hurricane Ian, and right, that area of Florida hadn't seen a major storm, in a couple of decades, and I think people just had difficulty wrapping their head around how dangerous it was going to be.
Yeah. Same for Sandra
Um,
here. We're celebrating,
yeah,
10 years on that. And, people just feel like it was once in a century or once in a lifetime. And
yeah.
it's always like build back better, strong. It's like they don't see that, it's going to continue.
But I think, my message is that even the sort of routine weather is changing in the sense that, right, people are like, yeah, we don't get as many snowstorms as we used to. It doesn't seem as cold as it used to be. Well, we can kind of quantify that.
Mm.
That is the change that we have to live with year to year. And to me, that's sort of, as I said, just easier to explain to people, and also I think maybe easier to motivate them to take action. Um,
On the,
as opposed to,
right.
one of the issues like with the Hurricane Sandy, and I think, right, there's been some movement, right? Like there's been some buyouts on Staten Island, and there's been some, reinforcing of things like the subway, making it more resilience. But, is New York City ready for another Sandy? No. How do you convince them to put the money in? I'm not sure.
Real estate is such a big element to it also. And, just recently I read that, even in Manhattan where we live part time, is that, it used to be the waterfront was for business or, on the waterfront, slaughterhouse
Yeah.
wasn't desirable, but now it is. So, you know, Sandy notwithstanding, more development goes towards, living at water's edge in so many places, which, you know,
Yeah, so I kind of wonder if, in some sense, that's a cultural thing that needs to change. That, we need to think about having those, low-lying shorelines as kind of more park areas, so that if they do flood,
mm.
it doesn't, it has a minimal impact on people.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. I read with regard to the plants that at 2 degrees, more than 10,000 plant species would lose half their habitat. I mean, that is, right, I don't know where you come out on this. I've been attending these summits, virtually, for COP27 and so on for sustainability and so on. But 2 degrees, and see, I think the other thing is that um, with all of this climate talk, it's not just local. I mean, you have to have a global perspective, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think look what happened this year with Pakistan and the floods. I mean, it's devastating.
Yes, yes.
So I think, you know,
I mean, the plant situation for us, like I said, is,
mm,
2 degrees and so many, would lose their habitat. I mean, we used to joke, at President Brooklyn Botanic Garden where I work, and he'd say, the dinosaurs never made it, but, the plants did, so, they're the survivors. But now when I read there's so many plants that could not make it, it's, um, you know,
well, I think there's two things, and you touched on, I think, both of them. One is, the changing temperature, and precipitation ranges, and the other is the invasive insects. And I think, you know, the pine bark beetle in the West is absolutely devastating, right? It's just really destroying forests relatively quickly. I mean, and that is a climate change thing, because because the winters are not as cold, as sharply cold for as long. Those beetles are surviving over the winter, and then their numbers are exploding.
I know.
So,
I guess
those
people
are the kinds of things in terms of fast changes that I particularly worry about, is related to invasive insects.
do too, and we're not prepared for it. And we get so far away from nature that, I even have garden design clients sometimes they'll say that I like the butterflies, but not the bees or the other things. Can you do that? And I'm like, no, pollinators, you know.
Pollinators
So
are
I think in
pollinators.
some ways, it's always been like a fear that we try to motivate people to take care of the planet, sustainability, and so on. But do you find in your work that there's another solution to try to engage folks and get them to make the hard choices that might be needed. Um,
I think what motivates people really varies. In terms of my students, they're, who are in their, late teens and 20s, and they're very motivated because they're worried, they're very worried. I think, to get governments to do things, because they have the resources, there's a lot of complications there. Um, so And
so
I think also the other issue is, environmental justice and equity. Sometimes people don't have an option. If your house is in a floodplain and you don't have the resources to move or to lift it up, to raise it,
yes,
you just may not have the option. And I was recently at a meeting where they were talking about managed retreat, and they were talking about sort of the sort of details of how that's hard to do, um on a lot of different levels. So I mean, it's been implemented to some extent here in North Carolina related to storm surge and flooding, but I think there's still a way to go, and part of that is, I think, just a better communication between government and the communities that are involved, because when you do a managed retreat, and sometimes you're dispersing communities that have been together for decades, and you know or like are tied to particular ways of utilizing the land. So I think we can do better with that, and I think that's something that we need to focus on.
so maybe with you and your students going forward, you're suggesting, I think I hear you say that there's a positive way to affect change without what has been just, I mean, nobody likes to be right, but when things start to happen as a consequence and you say, I don't want to say I told you so, but I told you so, you know. So are you suggesting that maybe going forward we would have a little bit more positive way to be able to manage?
Well, I think we want to approach this from a number of different directions. So one is, I think we want to think more preemptively rather than reacting after a major disaster like Hurricane Ian.
Yeah.
You know, if you're in an area that's at risk, what can you and your community do to reduce or mitigate, you know, those risks?
Mm-hmm.
I was at an interesting talk with some people from the insurance groups, and they talked about motivating people to reinforce the roof attachment to the house, and it doesn't cost very much, but then that reduces the probability that the roof's going to be ripped off in a hurricane. So these are kind of the preemptive things that we can do, and I think we need to be doing more of that. Right now, I think we're much more in a reactive mode.
Yeah.
So part of this is, explaining the risks, and then also part of it is giving people options for doing things that, are sort of, say, good return on investment to, as I said, adapt and reduce the risks of damage and loss of life.
Which is incredibly hopeful. And so, one of the things I'll say, I put this on the table, Sandra, because it's the hourglass, and it's sort of time is running out, for us.
Mhm.
But I think humans have a way of adapting, and I think technology will certainly bring us, back into it. But um, Bill, our Marty Scorsese here, is telling me that it's almost time. So I I would love to ask you if you can do a follow-up interview with us so that we can pursue some of these subjects a little bit more intense. I know you have such a busy schedule at the university, and I've been there. I have family in the state, which is one of
Yeah,
the.
no, I think I'd be happy to do a follow-up, and I think we can just organize that, and figure that out. I think probably at least a couple of weeks from now, because I've got a heavy schedule in the next few weeks. But I think let's arrange something and we'll figure it out.
Oh, that would be fantastic. So, just a couple more things I was going to ask. One, as the author of the Art of the Garnish book, I want to ask, what's your favorite cocktail?
Okay, so yeah, I noticed you asked this to a lot of your guests. So yeah, I think my favorite cocktail is actually a gin and tonic.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Why? I have to ask why.
I don't know. I just like it.
You
I
know,
think it's also not too complicated. I mean,
right?
and the thing that I often do is I'll get the gin and tonic and then I'll keep adding more tonic. So, it'll start strong and then weaken as as I go along.
I love it. I love it. I love it because and I got very, I think, more into gin and tonics the last 2 summers. A, because it was hot, but also because of the botanicals. It can change,
Yeah,
which is wonderful.
yeah.
So I toast you for this. I thank you for your patience for today, and we'll certainly make that up to you, Sandra. So happy Halloween. I hope
Okay, happy Halloween. And I love your tablescape. I think your cloud is fantastic.
this was
And
a special homage to you and to your
yeah.
work. And I love this. You know, what I didn't know, what I didn't realize is Goethe is the one that invented these pretty barometers, that use the glass. I mean, I've always
Mhm.
admired him, but to be able to see that, and yeah, then to create the clouds and so on. So thank you for noticing
Yeah, no, it's
the
great.
artful
All
homage.
right. Well, pleasure